The world of Richard Holden was built on perfection. At 51, he was one of the most respected businessmen in the country, a man who had turned ambition into an empire. His name was attached to skyscrapers, luxury resorts, and charity galas that sparkled under the light of cameras. But behind the immaculate suits and polished speeches lay a man who had long forgotten what simplicity felt like. His life revolved around control, numbers, decisions, reputation. He had everything money could buy, except the one thing he had lost along the way: peace. Richard had one son, Ethan, a boy of 17, brilliant yet rebellious. The death of his mother years earlier had left a hollow space between father and son, one that neither of them had been able to fill. Ethan saw his father as a stranger, someone who cared more about profit margins than people. Richard, in turn, struggled to understand his son's distance, the sarcasm, the constant defiance, the quiet sadness in his eyes. They lived in the same mansion, yet in two different worlds. And then there was Maria, the housekeeper. Maria worked for the Holdens for nearly 8 years. A woman in her late 40s, she was quiet, humble, and invisible in the way the wealthy liked their servants to be. Always present, never seen. She had come from a small coastal town where the ocean shaped both her fears and her faith. There was something about her eyes, soft yet strong, that made people trust her instinctively. She had watched Ethan grow up. In many ways, she had become the silent witness of the broken bond between father and son. When Ethan came home angry, she was the one who listened. When Richard left for another business trip, she was the one who reminded Ethan to eat. To Richard, she was just the help. To Ethan, she was perhaps the only person who still looked at him with warmth. It was late spring when Richard announced the trip. He had decided to take Ethan on a private voyage across the Atlantic, part business, part father-son bonding. The ship, the Seraphine, was one of his latest investments, a floating symbol of wealth and engineering. On board were only a handful of his closest associates, a few staff members, and by request, one of his domestic workers, Maria, to oversee personal services. Ethan protested, of course. The idea of being trapped on a ship with his father sounded like punishment. But Richard insisted. He wanted to fix things, to reconnect, to prove he wasn't the man. Ethan thought he was. Maria didn't want to go. The ocean, to her, was both beautiful and merciless. She had seen what it could take from people. But when Richard personally requested her presence, she had no choice. And so, on a golden morning that promised calm seas, the Seraphine left the port. At first, the voyage seemed peaceful, the kind of serenity that fools people into thinking nothing could go wrong. The waves glittered like glass under the sunlight. Richard walked the decks with a rare sense of ease, occasionally glancing at Ethan, who sat near the railing with his headphones on, lost in his own world. Maria watched from a distance, sensing something, a heaviness in the air, a strange unease that only intuition could detect. That night, as the ship moved deeper into open waters, the mood began to shift. The sky, once clear, turned a deep, unnatural grey. The wind picked up. The sea began to swell with restless force. Maria, cleaning near the galley, paused. Her hands trembled slightly as the floor beneath her feet tilted with a faint, unsteady motion. She looked through the small porthole. Waves were rising, higher each time. In the main hall, Richard received a call from the bridge. A storm had formed suddenly ahead of their route. It wasn't supposed to happen. The forecasts showed calm weather, but nature, as always, had no regard for human plans. Ethan appeared at the door, his face pale. "Dad, what's happening?" Richard tried to sound calm. "It's just a storm, nothing to worry about." But he didn't believe his own words. The ship groaned as lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the ocean in flashes of terrifying beauty. The wind howled like a living creature. Crew members ran down the corridors, shouting instructions, trying to secure everything they could. And in the midst of the chaos, Maria moved, steady, composed, guided by something beyond reason. She knew storms like this. She had seen the sea take lives before. When the first massive wave struck the Seraphine, the ship tilted sharply, sending furniture, glass, and terrified passengers crashing to the floor. Ethan screamed as the lights went out. Richard reached for his son, but in the darkness and confusion, they were separated by the violent sway of the deck. Maria heard the cries, and she ran. Through flooded corridors and collapsing walls of water, she followed the sound of Ethan's voice. She found him clinging to a broken railing, eyes wide with terror, as another wave crashed through the side of the ship. Without hesitation, Maria grabbed him, pulling him close, using her body as a shield against the raging sea. They fell together into the freezing water as the ship began to break apart. And somewhere, through the deafening roar of the ocean, Richard shouted his son's name, unaware that the woman he had barely noticed all these years was about to change his life forever. The storm raged through the night like a living beast. Waves, towering and merciless, crushed the remains of the Seraphine until only fragments of its once majestic form drifted across the black ocean. The sky, illuminated by flashes of lightning, revealed a world consumed by chaos. Wood splintering, voices screaming, the cruel hiss of rain against salt water. In the middle of that vast fury, Maria held on to Ethan with a strength that seemed impossible for her frail frame. Every wave slammed against them like a mountain of ice, but she refused to let go. She didn't think, she just acted. "Don't let go of me!" Ethan cried, his voice hoarse with fear. "I won't!" Maria shouted back, her arms tightening around him. "Hold on, son! Hold on!" She had called him son, not out of habit, but from a deep instinct, the same one that drives a mother to defy death for her child. Ethan didn't even notice. He was too cold, too terrified, too close to losing consciousness. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time lost its meaning when surrounded by the endless black water. The storm eventually began to weaken, though the ocean still heaved like a wounded creature. The rain softened, the lightning faded, and in the grey silence that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath. Maria's body trembled violently. She could barely keep her head above water. Then, through the mist, she saw something, a fragment of the ship's deck large enough to hold them both. With the last ounce of her strength, she pushed Ethan toward it and climbed up after him. They lay there, shivering, gasping, alive. Ethan's lips were blue, his hands cold and stiff. Maria ripped a piece of fabric from her soaked uniform and wrapped it around his shoulders. "Stay awake," she whispered. "You must stay awake." I can't feel my hands," Ethan murmured. Maria looked around. The horizon was empty. No ships, no land, only the vast, endless grey of dawn over a silent sea. But she refused to believe it was the end. "Listen to me," she said softly, holding his face between her trembling hands. "You'll be all right. Do you hear me? You're going to live." Something in her eyes, fierce, unwavering, cut through Ethan's despair. For the first time in his life, he felt protected, not by wealth, not by power, but by the sheer will of another human being. Hours later, as the sun rose weakly, Maria spotted a dark line in the distance. Land, a small island, barely visible through the haze. With renewed strength, she tore a piece of wood from the wreckage and began paddling. Every movement was agony. Her muscles screamed, her arms burned, but she didn't stop. When they finally reached the shore, both collapsed onto the sand. Ethan coughed up salt water, his body shaking uncontrollably. Maria fell beside him, her chest heaving, her face pale and bloodied but alive. They had survived. Meanwhile, miles away, Richard Holden stood on the deck of a rescue vessel, staring into the endless grey horizon. His hands trembled as he held the list of survivors. Names blurred by sea water and tears. Ethan's name was not there. He refused to accept it. For hours, he paced the deck, demanding that the search continue. "He's alive!" he shouted at the rescue team. "My son is alive! He has to be!" But as the sun set for the second time over the ruins of the Seraphine, the truth began to break through his denial. The cold wind bit into his skin, and for the first time in years, the mighty Richard Holden felt powerless, stripped of his control, his wealth, his image. All that remained was a father's pain. He thought of the last words he'd said to his son, a lecture about responsibility, delivered with frustration rather than love. He thought of all the moments he could have held Ethan and didn't, all the times he had chosen his empire over his own blood. Now, the silence of the ocean mocked him. When the captain finally convinced him to return to shore, Richard stood motionless, staring at the horizon. In his heart, something cracked open, a guilt, so deep it burned. But far away on a lonely island, the story was not over. Maria awoke to the sound of waves breaking gently against the rocks. The sky was clear now, painted in soft pinks and golds. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she turned and saw Ethan, lying a few feet away, breathing weakly but alive. She crawled toward him, touched his forehead. Warm. Relief flooded through her like sunlight. "Ethan," she whispered, "you made it." He opened his eyes slowly, squinting against the light. "Where are we?" "I don't know," she said, glancing at the dense line of trees beyond the beach. "But we're safe. That's what matters." They were stranded with no food, no shelter, and no way to call for help. But Maria's spirit was unbroken. She gathered driftwood, made a fire, found coconuts and rainwater. She worked quietly, methodically, while Ethan watched her, confused, amazed, and humbled. For the first time, he saw her not as a servant, but as a force of nature. In the following days, they learned to survive together. Ethan, unused to hardship, struggled at first. His hands blistered, his patience ran thin, but Maria never lost her calm. She taught him how to fish, how to listen to the rhythm of the sea, how to be grateful for every sunrise. At night, they spoke of home. Ethan told her stories of his mother, of how empty the house had felt since she died. Maria shared memories of her village, her faith, her belief that every person had a purpose. Even in tragedy, slowly, something began to shift between them. Ethan started to understand the kind of strength that had nothing to do with money, and Maria, though she rarely said it aloud, began to see in Ethan the son she never had. Days turned into weeks. The island became their fragile world, a place of survival, healing, and transformation. But fate was not done with them yet. The days that followed the shipwreck melted together in a blur of light and shadow. On that forgotten island, time no longer moved in hours or minutes. It moved in hunger, in exhaustion, in hope. Ethan and Maria had become two sides of the same survival, their lives tied together by the cruel sea that had taken everything but their breath. The fear that once ruled Ethan's heart had faded into something deeper, a kind of quiet strength. He no longer looked like the boy who had boarded the ship with headphones and anger. His skin was burned by the sun, his hands rough, his eyes sharper. Maria had watched this transformation in silence, with pride and pain mixed in her heart. They spent their days searching for food, building shelter, learning the rhythm of the land. At night, they sat by the fire, speaking less and feeling more. Silence no longer separated them. It connected them. One night, Ethan stared into the fire and said, "When we first met, I didn't even know your name." Maria gave a small, tired smile. "You never needed to," she said. "I was invisible, like most people who clean up." "After the rich," Ethan frowned. "That's not true anymore." He hesitated, the words trembling on his tongue. "I don't think I would be alive if it wasn't for you." Maria turned her gaze toward the flames, her face soft in the flickering light. "And I don't think I would have kept fighting if I hadn't seen you breathing beside me," she whispered. For a long time, they sat in silence. Then Maria said something she had never told anyone. "I once had a son," she said, her voice breaking slightly. Ethan's heart stopped. "What happened?" he asked. "Fever," she said. "There was no doctor. I prayed, but he was gone by morning." Her eyes glistened as she looked at the sky. "He would have been your age now." Ethan swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he murmured. Maria smiled gently through her grief. "Don't be. God took him because he knew one day I would need to be strong enough to save another boy." Ethan said nothing. He simply reached out and took her hand. The fire cracked softly, and for the first time since the storm, Maria felt warmth that wasn't from the flames. Across the ocean, Richard Holden had turned into a ghost of his former self. The powerful businessman who once commanded respect now lived in darkness, consumed by guilt and desperation. The authorities had called off the search for the Seraphine weeks ago, declaring all remaining passengers lost. But Richard refused to accept it. He spent his fortune hiring private search crews, oceanographers, and satellite teams. He traced every current, every possible drift of debris. His once proud face was now sunken, sleepless, and pale. Every night, he sat in his son's untouched room, staring at a framed photograph of Ethan smiling beside his mother. That smile had haunted him ever since. "Please," he whispered into the silence, "bring him back." But the house answered with only emptiness. Meanwhile, the island had become both prison and teacher. Ethan learned to fish with sharpened sticks, to read clouds, to collect rainwater. He no longer complained about the heat or hunger. Maria taught him how to be patient, how to trust the small signs of life around them. The flight of birds, the color of the tide, the whisper of the wind. Every morning they climbed a hill overlooking the sea, searching for any sign of rescue. Every evening they watched the sun die into the ocean and wondered if anyone out there still cared. One night, Ethan asked quietly, "Do you think anyone's looking for us?" Maria smiled. Father never stops looking for his child." Ethan looked away, his chest tightening. He thought of his father, the arguments, the silence, the distance. For the first time, he wanted to believe that somewhere, somehow, his father hadn't given up. Months passed. One day, while exploring the rocky shore, Ethan found something buried in the sand, a small metal cross, rusted but still shining faintly in the sunlight. He brought it to Maria, curious. When she turned it over, her breath caught. The letters MH were engraved on the back. It was hers, a pendant she had worn for years and lost during the wreck. "How is that possible?" Ethan asked. Maria looked out to the horizon. "Maybe it's a sign," she said softly. "Maybe the sea gives back what it takes when it's time." From that day on, she wore it again, and the pendant became a symbol of their shared hope. Whenever Ethan felt fear creeping in, he'd look at it and remember that miracles didn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they came in silence. Then one night the sky darkened, the sea turned restless, a storm rolled in, fiercer than any they had seen before. The island shook under roaring thunder. Ethan and Maria fought the wind, trying to keep their fire alive. Lightning split the sky open, and in that flash, Ethan saw something impossible, a blinking light far across the water. "Maria!" he shouted. "There's something out there!" They ran to the shore, shouting, waving, burning everything they could to signal. Their fire sputtered in the rain, but they refused to give up. "Please see us!" Ethan screamed, his voice lost in the wind. For a few moments the light blinked back, once, twice, and then vanished. When dawn came, the ocean was still again. Maria collapsed to her knees, exhausted. Ethan pulled her close. "We'll make it," he said. "I know we will." She looked at him, eyes filled with both doubt and love, and nodded. Hope, however small, was still alive. Far away, in the middle of a raging sea that looked like a living monster of black water and lightning, Richard Holden stood on the deck of a private search vessel, his face pale and wet with both rain and tears he didn't want anyone to see. The storm slammed against the ship with violent force, waves rising like walls around them, but he didn't move. He refused to leave that spot. For weeks, his world had been reduced to this endless horizon, to coordinates and false alarms, to the unbearable silence that followed every failed search. But this night, something was different. The radar technician, a young man with trembling hands, turned to him and said, "Sir, we caught a signal, faint, but it's coming from one of the southern islands." Richard's breath caught in his throat. For a second he couldn't even speak. He stared at the blinking dot on the radar screen, so small it could have been anything, a glitch, a reflection, a cruel trick of the storm. But his heart, broken as it was, knew better. "Show me," he said. His voice rough, almost desperate. The operator hesitated. "Sir, it could be interference. The storm's strong enough to—" "Plot the course!" Richard interrupted sharply, his voice suddenly filled with life again. "I don't care if it's a shadow. Go!" The captain turned the wheel, and the engines roared with power. The ship cut through the waves like a wounded beast, fighting for one last chance at victory. Richard gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon that swallowed everything. He could feel it, something pulling him forward, something invisible but real. It wasn't logic, it wasn't science, it was instinct. It was the faint heartbeat of a father who refused to stop believing. The wind howled around him. The salt stung his face, but for the first time in months Richard wasn't afraid. He whispered to himself, to the sea, to whoever might be listening, "Hold on, son, please, just hold on." Back on the island, the storm that had terrified them all night slowly began to die. The thunder faded into a distant growl, the rain softened into a whisper, and the waves gently kissed the shore instead of tearing it apart. The world seemed to exhale after hours of holding its breath. Ethan and Maria sat close to the fire, wrapped in torn blankets, their faces lit by a fragile orange glow that danced across their tired expressions. The fire crackled softly, fighting against the damp air. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They were both listening, not to the storm, but to the strange, comforting silence that followed it. For the first time in a long while, they weren't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. "Do you ever think," Ethan said finally, his voice low and thoughtful, "that maybe we were meant to survive for a reason?" His question hung in the air, honest and uncertain. Maria looked at him, her eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both sadness and faith. "Maybe the reason hasn't found us yet," she said. Ethan nodded, though deep inside he wondered if fate was already moving toward them in ways they couldn't see. The air around them felt different, alive somehow, as if the island itself knew that something was coming. Neither of them could have imagined that far beyond the black horizon, slicing through the dying storm, a ship was racing toward them, guided by a father's desperate hope and a destiny none of them could escape. The same ocean that had tried to destroy them was now quietly carrying salvation their way, pulled by an invisible thread that had tied their souls together since that terrible night when the sea took everything, except the chance to be found. The storm had passed, leaving behind a shattered calm. The sea stretched endlessly, flat and grey, like a mirror that refused to reflect. Waves rolled lazily toward the horizon, and the world smelled of salt, rain, and rebirth. On the island, the first rays of sunlight broke through the ragged clouds, painting the soaked jungle in streaks of gold and green. It was as if nature itself had forgiven its own violence. Maria awoke first. Her body ached from the long night, her clothes clinging damp to her skin, her hair heavy with salt. For a moment she didn't move. She simply listened. The air was still, broken only by the distant cries of seabirds returning to the coast. That sound, so ordinary, made her eyes fill with tears. It meant life. It meant survival. Ethan was still asleep beside the ashes of the fire, his face pale but peaceful. She watched him for a while, the boy who had become more like her own child than anyone she had ever known. In the lines of his expression, she saw the innocence he had lost and the strength he had found. Carefully she rose and walked toward the shore. There was something strange in the air, a faint hum like a vibration beneath the wind. She frowned, her heartbeat quickening. She scanned the horizon. At first, she saw Nothing but the long, endless blue. But then, through the mist, a dark shape emerged, distant, small, but unmistakably real. A ship. For a second, her mind refused to believe it. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, then gasped sharply. The noise escaped her before she could stop it. "Ethan!" she shouted, her voice trembling. "Ethan, wake up!" He stirred, groggy, then saw her pointing to the horizon. He jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. "Oh my God," he whispered. "It's a ship!" They ran, stumbling over rocks and wet sand, waving their arms, shouting until their throats hurt. Maria tore a piece of fabric from her clothing and tied it to a branch, waving it frantically like a flag. Ethan joined her, his voice breaking with desperation. "Here! We're here!" He screamed again and again. The vessel was still far, barely moving. Or maybe it was. It was impossible to tell from that distance. The minutes stretched into eternity. The ocean played cruel tricks with perspective. Sometimes the ship seemed closer, sometimes it disappeared completely behind waves or mist. "Please see us," Maria murmured, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. "Please." And then a sound, a deep, echoing blast from a horn rolled over the sea, low and powerful. Ethan froze. "Did you hear that?" Maria covered her mouth, her knees weakening. "They saw us," she whispered. "They saw us." The ship turned slowly, angling toward the island. The sunlight caught its white hull, and for the first time in months, the sea no longer looked like an enemy. It looked like salvation. On the deck of the approaching vessel, Richard Holden stood motionless as the binoculars fell from his hands. He didn't need them anymore. He could see it with his own eyes. The faint flicker of movement on the beach, two figures waving like mad, two sparks of life where there should have been none. His throat tightened. He couldn't speak. His body trembled as if his heart had suddenly remembered how to beat after being frozen for too long. "Bring us in!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Get the rescue team ready, now!" The captain nodded, barking orders to the crew. Engines roared. The ship surged forward through the waves. Richard gripped the railing with both hands, staring at that small island that had been nothing but a pin on a map for so long. Could it really be them? He didn't dare believe it. He had dreamed this moment so many times that it felt unreal, and yet the closer they got, the more real it became. Through his binoculars, one of the rescuers confirmed it. "Two survivors, sir. One male, one female. Looks like a young man, possibly late teens." Richard's knees nearly gave out. He leaned against the railing, his chest tight, tears blurring his vision. "Ethan," he whispered. "Oh my God, Ethan." Back on the island, Ethan and Maria could now see the ship clearly. It was large, gleaming white, with a red insignia across its hull. Crew members stood along the deck, pointing, waving. The sound of a helicopter echoed in the distance. "They're sending a boat," Ethan cried. Maria's hands shook as she grabbed his shoulders. "It's over," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "We're going home." When the rescue team finally reached them, Ethan could barely stand. His legs trembled beneath him, thin and weak from hunger and exhaustion, but his spirit was still burning with the fragile fire of survival. The men in bright orange uniforms lifted him carefully into the small motorboat, their hands steady, their voices low and full of awe. They wrapped both him and Maria in thick grey blankets that smelled faintly of salt and diesel. The sudden warmth felt unreal, almost painful against their frozen skin. Maria wept silently, her tears mixing with the salt from the sea, her hands clutching Ethan's as though letting go would shatter the fragile line that still connected them to life itself. Neither of them spoke. Words had become too small for the moment. There were no sounds in existence that could hold the weight of gratitude, relief, and disbelief that filled their hearts. The motorboat sliced through the grey water, leaving behind the cursed island that had both imprisoned and saved them. As the larger ship loomed closer, Ethan's heart began to pound so hard he thought it might break through his chest. He lifted his head, his eyes scanning the deck above, a blur of figures, uniforms and movement, searching without even knowing what he was searching for. And Then, like the sudden clearing of fog after a storm, he saw him, Richard Holden. For one suspended heartbeat, time stopped. Ethan froze, unable to breathe. The world tilted. His father looked different, older, smaller, stripped of the armor of power and pride that had once defined him. There were deep lines around his eyes now, carved by grief and sleepless nights. His expensive clothes were damp from sea spray, his hair wild and streaked with silver. But most striking of all were his eyes. Wide red, filled with tears and trembling disbelief. He clutched the railing so tightly his knuckles were white, as if afraid that if he blinked, his son would vanish like a mirage. "Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking like a child's. It was barely a sound, but across the water Richard heard it, his face crumpled, his lips trembling. For a moment he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. When the boat bumped gently against the side of the larger vessel, Richard didn't wait for protocol or help. He bolted down the metal stairs, nearly tripping in his haste, shoving aside the hands that tried to steady him. His shoes clanged against the metal steps as he descended, every movement fueled by desperation, disbelief, and love. When he reached the deck where Ethan stood, father and son simply stared at one another. Two souls that had once been worlds apart, now bound by the same pain and relief. Between them hung the invisible years of distance, arguments left unfinished, words unsaid, pride unbroken. Yet in that instant none of it mattered. Richard's breath came in ragged bursts. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice trembling, almost breaking under its own weight. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, his lips trembling as he forced a faint smile. "You almost did," he whispered, and then the years collapsed between them. Without another word, Richard pulled his son into his arms. The embrace was raw, desperate, trembling, the embrace of a father who had finally found the piece of himself he thought the ocean had stolen forever. He sobbed openly, his entire body shaking as Ethan held him back, neither of them able to speak. Around them, the crew grew silent, watching in reverence as a man who owned everything was brought to his knees by the only thing he could never buy: love. Some turned away, wiping at their own eyes, unwilling to intrude on something so pure, so profoundly human. Maria stood a few steps back, her hands pressed to her chest, watching through tears that refused to stop. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, not here, not now, but the sight of that reunion broke something deep inside her. Every sleepless night, every shiver in the dark, every prayer whispered into the wind had led to this moment. To see the impossible become real made every hardship worth enduring. Richard finally pulled back, still holding Ethan's face in his trembling hands, studying every feature like he needed proof that this was no illusion. Then his gaze drifted past his son and landed on Maria. For the first time, their eyes met, and something flickered in his expression, a faint recognition, a whisper from the past. "You," he said softly, almost afraid to trust the memory. "You were our housekeeper." Maria nodded slowly, lowering her gaze in quiet humility. "Yes, sir." Richard took a shaky breath, emotion thick in his throat. "You saved my son," he said, his voice filled with awe and gratitude so raw it almost hurt to. "Oh, here." Maria hesitated, her eyes glistening. She shook her head gently. "No," she said in a soft, trembling voice. "He saved me too." For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of the ocean filled the silence, vast and eternal, as if bearing witness to the truth that had bound them all together. Richard's throat tightened again. He looked at both of them, his son, alive and changed, and the woman who had risked everything for him. And something inside him broke open. For the first time in his life, he understood that money, power, and control were illusions. None of it had mattered. None of it could have saved his son. Only compassion, sacrifice, and faith had done that. That night, after the initial chaos faded and the ship anchored near the island, the crew busied themselves with reports, medical exams, and endless radio transmissions. But Richard barely noticed any of it. His world had narrowed to a single room, the infirmary, where Ethan and Maria rested on narrow beds, clean and fed and wrapped in white blankets. The quiet hum of machinery and the steady rhythm of their breathing were the sweetest sounds he had ever heard. He sat between them, unwilling to leave. His hands trembled slightly, hovering over Ethan's arm, as if reassuring himself that his son was truly there. He didn't want to close his eyes. He was terrified that if he did, he might wake up back in his empty mansion, surrounded by silence, and realize this had all been a dream, cruelly born of grief. When Maria finally drifted into sleep, her face softened by exhaustion, Ethan turned weakly toward his father. His voice was soft, hoarse from disuse. "I used to think you didn't care," he said, "that you only loved what you built." Richard looked at him, pain flashing in his eyes. "I thought I was protecting you," he murmured. "I thought giving you everything meant I was being a good father. But I was wrong. I forgot what really mattered." Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. "You didn't lose me," he said. "You just had to find me again." Richard smiled too, but tears rolled down his cheeks. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. "And I did," he whispered. For the first time in years, they both felt peace, fragile, but real. Yet even in that peace, a shadow stirred in Richard's mind, a quiet unease that refused to fade. As he sat there in the soft glow of the infirmary lights, he turned his gaze toward the window. Outside, the dark sea shimmered under the moonlight, vast and mysterious. "Why her?" he murmured almost to himself. "Why was she there, on that ship, at that exact moment?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, swallowed by the steady rhythm of the waves. He didn't know, not yet, that the answer was waiting in Maria's heart, buried deep beneath years of silence and sorrow. A truth she had carried alone, one that bound her fate to his family in ways none of them yet understood. A truth that, once revealed, would change everything. Not just for Richard Holden, but for the meaning of the miracle that had brought them together on the edge of life and death. Because sometimes, fate does not save people by accident. It brings them together for a reason, one that the ocean, in its infinite wisdom, had known all along. The night after the rescue, the ship rocked gently in the calm sea, a lullaby that neither Ethan nor Maria could fully feel. The infirmary lights cast soft shadows, and the quiet hum of machinery mixed with the faint splash of waves against the hull. Richard Holden remained by Ethan's side, unable to leave, his hands clenched in silent prayer. His son was alive, breathing, and yet the weight of what had happened, the months of absence, the endless nights of fear, still pressed heavily on him. Every heartbeat reminded him of how fragile life could be, how quickly it could vanish, and how meaningless power and wealth were in the face of fate. Maria sat quietly on a cot nearby, wrapped in blankets, her hands folded in her lap. She was exhausted, yet sleep eluded her. Her mind raced, tracing back the steps that had brought her here, to this impossible convergence of lives. She thought of the morning she had been assigned to clean the ship, of the mundane routines that had seemed so insignificant at the time. Who would have imagined that a simple decision, a shift in schedules, a missed bus, would place her exactly where she needed to be, at the precise moment to save a life? It was almost too much to bear, the weight of destiny pressed against her chest. Richard's eyes, however, were no longer solely filled with relief. There was a question burning in them, one he couldn't yet voice. Something about Maria felt familiar, as if a memory he could not fully recall had been awakened by her presence, by the uncanny timing of her actions. And so, while Ethan slept fitfully, he leaned closer to her, his voice trembling with curiosity, gratitude, and a hint of unease. "Tell me," he said, quietly, "who are you, really?" Maria hesitated. The words had been locked away for years, secrets she had carried alone. Slowly she began to speak, and with each revelation, the tension in the room thickened, pressing against the walls as if the past itself had returned to claim its place. She spoke of her life before the ship, of her own loss, a son she had once held and then lost to a fever, a child she had loved more than herself, and the hollow emptiness that had followed. She spoke of struggles, of nights spent praying for strength, and of a quiet, persistent hope that one day she might be able to save someone else's life as she had been unable to save her own child. Richard listened in silence, each detail gnawing at him, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. And then came the revelation that made his blood run cold. Maria told him of her previous work for his family, long before Ethan's birth, long before the fateful voyage. She had been employed as a caretaker for Richard's late wife, a woman of gentle heart who had entrusted Maria with the most intimate care of her home and her family. She described the nights she had spent comforting the child, singing him to sleep, and the days when she had carried messages between mother and son, unknowingly nurturing a bond that would later prove crucial. Richard's mind reeled. He had remembered glimpses of a woman in the household, a figure in the background, kind yet unassuming, whose presence had seemed so ordinary at the time. And now, faced with Maria, this same woman standing before him after months of desperation and danger, he realized that fate had orchestrated a reunion he had never imagined. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice trembling. You were there all along?" Maria nodded, her gaze steady. "I was," she said, "and perhaps that is why I survived the storm too, because this was meant to be, to bring us together, to save your son, to give him a second chance at life." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. Ethan stirred in his sleep, sensing the gravity of the conversation even through unconsciousness. Richard's hands shook as he reached out, taking Maria's in his. He didn't know whether to cry, to thank her, or to simply collapse into relief. Everything he had believed about power, wealth, and control had been stripped away by the relentless sea, by fear, and by the quiet heroism of a woman he had scarcely noticed before. She had done what he could never have done, what no amount of money could buy. She had saved his son, and in doing so she had reminded him of the fragile human truths that life often hides behind walls of privilege. Over the next days, as the ship made its way back to the mainland, the three of them grew closer. The physical safety they had achieved could not immediately erase the emotional scars of the past months, nor the years of estrangement between father and son. But in the quiet hours, they shared stories, laughter, and the kind of silences that speak more profoundly than words. Ethan, now strong and alert, asked endless questions about Maria's life, about the island, about survival, and about the strange coincidences that had brought them together. Maria answered, patient and gentle, never revealing the full depth of her grief, only enough to guide Ethan through the understanding of courage, resilience, and hope. Richard, meanwhile, began to confront himself. He reflected on the mistakes he had made as a father, the times he had been absent emotionally, even while providing materially. He recognized that Ethan's survival had been as much a test of character for him as it had been a battle for life on the ocean. The experience stripped away his arrogance, revealing a raw, vulnerable man who had nearly lost everything that truly mattered. He vowed, silently and with all the force of a man reborn, that he would never again take his son's presence for granted. And yet, even as they celebrated survival and the reunion of family, the ocean still held its secrets. There were questions that could not yet be answered, questions about timing, coincidence, and the invisible threads that had bound these lives together. Richard found himself staring out across the dark, rolling waters, haunted by a single thought. Why Maria had been there, why the universe had allowed her to be in the right place at the right time, and how such intricate webs of fate could exist in a world governed by chaos. Maria, sensing the weight of Richard's unspoken questions and the storm of thoughts behind his gaze, reached out and touched his arm lightly. Her fingers lingered there for a moment, not as a gesture of reassurance alone, but as a subtle bridge between two souls who had been battered by fate and fear. "Some things," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of unshakable certainty, are beyond explanation. The sea chooses who it saves, just as it chooses who it tests. It does not reason, it does not pity, and it does not answer to anyone's prayers. And yet, in its incomprehensible ways, it sometimes grants moments of grace, moments of second chances that seem impossible. We were all given a chance. You, your son, and me. That is enough. Perhaps that is all we are ever meant to ask for. The chance to survive, to learn, to change, to see what truly matters before life slips through our fingers. Richard's eyes, heavy with exhaustion, and months of unbearable longing, met hers fully for the first time. He saw beyond the woman who had served his family, beyond the quiet presence who had saved his son, beyond the ordinary shell that had seemed so unremarkable in the past. He saw a woman of astonishing courage, unwavering strength, and profound wisdom, a soul forged by suffering, tempered by humility, and honed by the choices she had made when every instinct screamed for self-preservation. Her existence on that island, her presence in the storm, her actions that had defied logic and expectation, all of it had altered the course of his life, forever and irrevocably. He realized then, with a depth of clarity that shook him to his core, that gratitude alone could never suffice. Mere thanks could never measure the magnitude of what had been done. Respect, humility, and a lifelong commitment to honor the lessons they had all learned. These were the only fitting responses to such an extraordinary gift of fate, life, and human courage. As the days stretched into weeks aboard the ship, Ethan began to thrive under his father's careful attention, his body regaining strength, his mind slowly unburdening itself of fear and despair. Yet the bond he had formed with Maria, forged in the crucible of shared danger and the quiet terror of near death, remained unbroken. It was a bond unlike any other, built not on blood or obligation, but on shared struggle, trust earned in the harshest circumstances, and a mutual understanding of vulnerability and resilience. Every glance between them carried a depth of meaning, a silent acknowledgement that the tides of fortune and misfortune could rise and fall in ways no one could anticipate, and yet their connection had endured, unshakable and true. The world outside the ship continued its relentless march, oblivious to the fragile rebirth taking place within its walls. Storms would still rage, deadlines and obligations awaited, and the cold indifference of life pressed on in countless forms. Yet inside that vessel, amid the hum of engines and the occasional call of a crew member, a family had been reborn. One that understood, finally, with the clarity of souls who had stared into the abyss and returned, that true strength is not measured by wealth, influence, or control. True strength, they now knew, was measured by the capacity to love when it is hard, to sacrifice when it is inconvenient, to endure when the world has nothing left to offer but hardship. It was measured in the quiet heroism of surviving, of choosing connection over pride, compassion over self-interest, and hope over despair. And beneath it all, the ocean, eternal, vast, and impossibly mysterious, lay in wait, unchanging, yet all-seeing. It had tested them mercilessly, separated them with its unforgiving waves, and then, in a way that defied reason, had reunited them, binding their fates in ways no human understanding could ever fully comprehend. Every wave whispered its ancient secrets. Every swell echoed the lesson that life's greatest revelations are rarely free, and that survival often comes not to those who are strongest or most clever, but to those whose hearts are capable of enduring, of daring, of trusting in forces far greater than themselves. The story of survival, revelation, and redemption was far from over. The days ahead would bring new challenges, new questions, and the undeniable weight of reflection on what it truly means to be alive. But for now, as Richard, Ethan, and Maria stood together, father, son, and the quiet hero who had bridged a chasm of fate, they had each other. In that fragile, fleeting, and miraculous unity, they had found everything that truly mattered. The ocean continued to shimmer in the moonlight beyond the ship's railing, its dark depths hiding both danger and mercy, its waves a constant reminder that life, in all its vastness and mystery, was a gift, and that some miracles, no matter how improbable, were worth every tear, every risk, every heartbeat spent in hope. The journey back to the mainland felt surreal. The ship cut silently through calm waters, the ocean now a mirror of silver under the rising sun. Waves lapped gently against the hull, as if celebrating the survival of the 3 souls on board. Inside, the air was thick with quiet reflection. Richard sat beside Ethan, holding his hand loosely, watching the boy's face as he slept. Each exhale, each heartbeat, reminded him of what he had almost lost, and of the woman who had saved his son from the merciless grasp of the sea. Maria moved quietly, walking the deck alone, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She thought of the island, now a mere silhouette in the distance, of the storm that had taken everything from them, and yet had given them the one gift money could never buy: life, survival, and an unbreakable bond. Every detail of that night returned to her mind. The cold spray of water, Ethan's terrified cries, Richard's absent presence, and she realized the magnitude of her actions. She had acted without thought for herself, propelled only by instinct and compassion, and in doing so, she had changed the course of 3 lives forever. As the mainland approached, the reality of returning to society loomed heavily. Richard's world, a world of mansions, boardrooms, and endless obligations, awaited them. The thought filled him with anxiety he had not expected. The idea of facing his associates, friends, and distant relatives while carrying the raw vulnerability of what had just occurred was overwhelming. He feared judgment, pity, and the inability to explain the improbable events that had saved Ethan. Yet more than anything, he feared losing the purity of this moment, this fragile connection between father, son, and Maria, in the very world he had spent a lifetime building. When the ship finally docked at the private marina, a small crowd of aides and family friends had gathered, their faces reflecting concern, curiosity, and barely concealed judgment. Cameras were absent, but whispers filled the air, as though the entire world could sense the magnitude of what had transpired. Richard descended first, steadying Ethan by the arm, his own legs trembling slightly from months of fear and uncertainty. Maria followed, her posture modest but proud, aware that all eyes would soon be on her, a woman who had acted heroically yet would not claim the glory. The reunion with Richard's household staff and distant relatives was a mixture of awe and disbelief. Stories of the storm, the wreck, and the miraculous survival had already begun circulating, though in fragmented, sensationalized form. Friends and associates approached with cautious smiles, some holding back tears, others nodding in polite acknowledgement, and a few with thinly veiled skepticism. Richard noticed it all, but ignored their reactions. For him, only the bond in that small, restored family mattered. Ethan, still weak, but recovering, clung to his father's side, while Maria stood quietly, observing, unafraid, her dignity shining through the chaos of admiration and curiosity. Later that evening, in the quiet of Richard's study, a moment finally emerged for reflection. The city lights glittered far below, indifferent to the personal miracles that had unfolded on the high seas. Richard poured himself a drink, though he did not drink it, instead letting it sit in his hand as he watched Ethan asleep on a couch nearby. Maria had taken a seat opposite him, her gaze calm yet penetrating. There was a silence between them that carried the weight of everything that had occurred, and the unspoken understanding that their lives had been intertwined by forces far beyond human comprehension. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low and careful. "Maria," he began, "there is something I need to ask you, something I've wondered ever since that night." He paused, searching for words that could bridge gratitude, curiosity, and awe. "Why were you really there? Why did the sea allow you to be there at that exact moment?" Maria's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. She took a deep breath, and for the first time revealed the secret she had carried for years. "Richard, you never knew. Before you and your family became who you are today, before your son was born, I had a connection to your wife. She trusted me in ways she never trusted anyone else. I was in her confidence, and when she passed, she left me with a promise to protect her family in whatever way life allowed. That is why I was there. That is why I survived the storm. It was not chance. It was a promise fulfilled." Richard's head fell back slightly, his hand pressing against his forehead. The truth hit him like a tidal wave. Everything, every coincidence, every inexplicable moment, Maria's presence, her courage, the timing of the rescue. It was all part of a chain of devotion, a legacy of care left behind by a woman he had loved and lost. His grief, mingled with awe and relief, left him momentarily speechless. I don't know what to say," he whispered finally. "You've done more than anyone could have asked, more than I ever could have imagined." Maria's lips curved in a faint, serene smile. "You don't have to say anything, just live differently, love more openly, appreciate what you have. That is all the thanks any of us could ask for." In that moment, the family, father, son, and Maria, felt a profound shift. The experience at sea, the ordeal, the revelation of hidden loyalties and promises had transformed them. Richard realized that wealth and power had never mattered. What mattered was trust, courage, selflessness, and the willingness to act when everything is at stake. Days turned into weeks. Ethan regained his strength fully, reconnecting with the world he had been almost denied. He began to see his father not only as a man of authority, but as a father capable of growth, humility, and deep love. Maria became an inseparable part of their lives, no longer merely a caretaker or hero, but a guardian of the family's emotional and moral compass. Together, the three navigated a world that had once been cold and indifferent, now alive with second chances, deep bonds, and the knowledge that some acts of courage can ripple through generations. And even as life returned to a semblance of normality, business meetings, social obligations, and the relentless tick of time, the ocean remained, forever a reminder of the fragility and wonder of existence. Its waves, silent and eternal, whispered that miracles are possible, that survival is never accidental, and that sometimes the bravest and most ordinary acts are the ones that change the world. Richard, standing at the window one quiet evening, watching the sun set over the harbour, finally understood the lesson the sea had taught them all. He turned to Maria and Ethan, seeing the two who had been bound to him by fate and courage, and whispered, "We are alive, together, and nothing, not wealth, not fear, not time, can take that away." Maria smiled. Ethan reached for his father's hand, and the three of them stood together in silence, knowing that though the storm had passed, the impact of that night would echo through their lives forever, a story of survival, redemption, and the quiet, unstoppable power of human courage.